Hello there, everyone. Welcome. We're just getting set up here. Simon Walker here. We've also got Darrin Frankovitz. We'll introduce ourselves properly in a second, but we're just making sure all the tech works and the audio works. You can see the screen and that sort of stuff. But welcome. And you'll see inside the webinar software, there's an ability to have a look at the chat window. We've already got some information in there about the sessions and where to look at previous ones. I'll talk more about that in a second. But if you are able to hear me and you can see the screen and you can see me and Darrin, would you mind just saying something in the chat window or the questions box so that we can just make sure that the technology is all working? Hi, Stephen. Hello from Toronto. Excellent. Thank you for that. And make sure that we're actually talking to you. Thanks, Jukka. Thanks, Michael and Jim and Matt and Rob. Excellent. It seems to be working. This is good. Great stuff. So officially, hello, welcome. I'm Simon Walker. I'm Director of Training at Maxon, and we're delighted to have our very own Darrin Frankovitz, our lead trainer in all things cinema and Redshift, of course. So welcome, Darrin. Nice to see you back.
Thank you.
And if you've been attending any of these previous sessions, of which I've got the PDF up on my screen here, you may have spotted Darrin's answers. He's been helping out in the background, helping us with answers on some of the previous sessions. So now we're delighted to welcome him with all his experience. It's the many years. I won't say how many years, just many years of experience in doing these things. So that's fantastic. And if you want to, just a bit of housekeeping, if you want to watch this earlier session, this is a repeat of the earlier session today, or any of the other sessions, you could just click on the links in this PDF. And the links magically turn in from registration links, if they're ones for, say, tomorrow or Thursday, into the links to the recording. So if you wanted to share those with any of your colleagues, share this PDF, please do. The download link for it is inside the chat window. And also, during the session today, feel free to ask questions because we can field questions as we're going along. And if they're relevant to what Darrin's talking about, I will then interrupt him. But I'll try not to interrupt you too much, Darrin, because we've got lots of things to get going and so on. But in fact, to that point, let me switch over my screen and share it with you. Here we go. And I can ask you also whilst I'm doing that, what sort of things are you planning for this session? Could you give us a quick overview of the sorts of things that you're going to be looking at today, Darrin?
Yeah, so so today we are, I'm focusing really just on the modeling behind this scene. And tomorrow's materials, and then Thursday is going to be some, MoGraph, texturing in Redshift, and some additional Redshift rendering stuff. But today is all modeling, and it's actually this geometry here. Basically, this is very much a rough and quick breakdown of how I did that scene in the render, and I am opening up. There it is, and here is that actual scene with the. Let's show the wireframe.
Fantastic.
Textures.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to switch off my webcam just to save us some bandwidth, and also it makes the screen a bit larger for end users. And we've lost your screen though, Darrin.
Uh-oh.
I just see you now instead of your screen.
I clicked on the wrong icon. Let's turn that off.
Oh, it's back. There we go. So
okay.
It's back. It's filling the screen.
Okay.
Yes,
good.
I can see it.
All right. So any more announcements, or we're good?
No, we're trying to keep the preamble to as minimum as possible. We're all good to go. So thank you.
All right, cool. So again, let me pull up that render. So I'm actually going to be breaking down the motor with the vent holes, the fan blades, the bracket, the arms, this sort of melting bulb, the ceiling tiles, the chain, and the transforming and everything. So let's jump into it. it's going to be a lot of basic stuff. You know, I'm not getting too deep into polygonal modeling. So I'm working a lot with splines and generators, and just the basic primitive parametric objects. So I'm actually going to start with the motor here, and very much this, you know, this is very simple. You know, I'm actually going to start this with not a cube or a sphere, but the tube. And this is all about working with the bool object. So if I turn off my bool here and turn off the tube, this is actually what is being cut from this tube. So I have essentially just this spline. And then I'm cloning that radially and then extruding it. And then that is being cut using the bool object. So I'm going to actually go ahead and do this. So I'm going to create a new project, drop in a tube, and just sort of rough in the shape. One thing that's really important is to have some rounding on the edges here. So I'm going to enable the fillet option, make it a little wider, and add some more segments to it. I'm also going to add some segments here on the rotation. And thinking about the segments, I actually want to make sure that when I'm looking at it in the top view, that those segments are, that those segments are actually lined up on the Z and the X axis. And they're actually a little off. So I'm going to go to the rotation segments and just turn them up one, and there we go. Now they're all lined up. And you'll see why I'm doing this in a moment, because now I'm actually going to draw the spline that I'm going to clone and extrude. So I'm going to come in here so I can see the grid of the world, and I'm going to turn on my snapping with work plane snap, and I'm going to go to my spline pen. And I'm just going to go click and drag here. And then down here, click and drag, but not quite as far. And then to finish this off, I'm just going to check close spline. Now I have this basic shape, excuse me, which I'm going to clone. So I'll go ahead and I'll hold down the Alt key and add the cloner object and set its mode to radial. I'm going to set the radius down to 0 and increase the count. And what I'm looking for here is I'm actually looking at where these little egg shapes are relative to all the edges that I see. And I want these to be lined up pretty much all the same way. So here, this first one, I have it centered on this edge, and it's sort of like framed over these two polygons. And I want all of the segments to be like that. And I like to do it this way because it just helps with the having a slightly cleaner geometry, because the bool object does create n-gons, or like triangles, which aren't great, but I can live with them. So I got that cloned, and I think I'm just gonna move it. Let's Shift S turns on and off the snapping. I'm just gonna move that down a bit so I can see it on the bottom here. And then I'm gonna Alt click on the extrude object. Now we can see that it is extruding this one bit. I do need to enable the hierarchical option in that extrude. And then I'm gonna place both of these into the bool object right here. So the bool allows us to basically take two objects, and from it we can get some sort of results from a combination or subtraction or intersection of a Boolean operation. So we have A subtract B. A is the first object in the list, B is the second object. So I'm actually going to flip this around like so. And A subtract B, now I have those holes. But to get the, the lighting to play on, here, let's zoom here, to play on this rounded bit, I actually need something in here that's round. So I'm going to go to the extrude, and in its caps, I'm going to go ahead and start off with load preset, and I'm going to choose this basic rounding. And it's actually going,
Darrin,
yeah, please.
just whilst you're doing that, could you just mention, we had a question earlier about the difference between modeling it the way that you're doing versus creating an element which you then replicate using an array, and the different anomalies it might introduce. So I just wondered if it was worth just comparing those two methods.
Let's see. Well, I am more familiar and comfortable working with the cloner. There's a lot more flexibility there. Now, if I take the, okay, so we'll shift gears here. And if I were doing this in an array, then I would put the spline in the extrude, okay? And I would still need to set up the rounding, so I'll finish doing that. 5 is a bit big, so I'll say like not 3, but I actually want it to be -3, and then it actually goes up. So I need to actually enable extend shape and set the height to match. So now it actually is giving me that curve. Now, if this were going into an array, and I haven't tried this yet, so let's see how that goes. Add the array object, and then make the extrude a child of it, and there we go. There's the array. See this, so like I can turn that radius down. Let's get into the top view here. So I set the radius to 0. I can set the copy. So, it's very, very similar, but there are far fewer options. And I just prefer working with the cloner.
Got it.
Not
Thank
sure
you.
if that helps them.
Yep, perfect.
Okay, cool. So let's see here. Now I got that rounded bit on there, but I need to position it a little better. So let's actually turn on that bool. So now while I drag up the extrude, I can actually see that rounded bit start to cut into it. The way that I like to position this is actually to go into this front view, turn off that bool, and now with that extrude object, I can zoom in real close, I can move it up, and then I can zoom in even closer to the point where I don't see the axis handle anymore. And now to ensure that I am moving it simply up and down, I'll lock the X and lock the Z. Now when I click and drag anywhere in my view, it's only moving on its Y axis, and I can very finely position it right outside of that tube there. So then when I come back in here, I'm getting the most rounding from that extruded curve on that spline. Let's see, another thing that I like to do to avoid some shading issues is to do the create single object and create Phong breaks at intersection. That's actually the big one. And what this does is if we look closely at the shading on this, where the rounding meets the flat surface, you'll notice maybe a subtle change there. Let's come in at this angle. You can actually see a bit of those shading artifacts. It's like little triangles. And then when I turn on Phong breaks, those are gone. And I'm happy with that. So that's the first part of this model. The second part is really just sort of like basics, extruding a spline. So that is going to be the fan blade. Let's see here. That is also in the cloner. Let's focus our view on it. And we can, there we go. So let's turn off the extrude so we can check out that spline. So I'm just gonna build that really quick back to my untitled scene. And whenever I'm drawing a spline, especially one that's going to be sort of like a solid model, I always like to do it in the in a flat view, in the top or front view. So I'm gonna, in the top view, I'm gonna enable my polygon pen again, turn my snapping on. I'm gonna come in, let's see, let's say about here, and I'm gonna click and drag out a bit. And then how big do I want this fan blade? Let's say it comes out to here, and I'm just clicking, not clicking and dragging, and then I'm going to go an equal number of snaps over here, click, and then back down here, click, and that has closed the spline. Now I just want to sort of get that shape in there. So I'm going to need a few more points right here in the middle. I'm going to hold Control, and I can actually Control click to add a point right there. And let's see, I think I'll just sort of move that, oops. Let's just move that point up like so. Yes, Simon?
You could anticipate me asking something. Sorry. We had a question in the earlier session, which I thought you gave a fantastic answer to, which was the concept of modeling to a specific measurement versus modeling to proportions and then changing the project scaling. So I just wondered if you could quickly mention that.
Yeah, so earlier the question was, am I modeling to a real world physical scale? And I am actually not here because this is a very rough breakdown. If we're modeling with like a physical renderer, and we want to get the most realistic results, and we do want to model to real world scale. But the good news is that we can take whatever we have here and set it to the scale that we want it to be. So for example, this spline, if I select all the points of it, I can see down here that on the z-axis, it's 600 centimeters long. So for example, let's say that we actually need this to be 4.5 feet. So what we can do is we can go to, there's two places to get to this command. It's scale project. You can go to the edit menu and go scale project, or you can go to the project settings, and then here is scale project. It's the same command in either location. And I'm going to set the current scale to be this 600 centimeters. And then I want it to be let's say 3.5 feet. And then I hit OK. And then actually everything has scaled now. So the unit display isn't still in centimeters, but it is now, that's the centimeter equivalent to 3.5 feet. So yeah, I hope that
Excellent, thank you.
that helps. You're welcome. So let's see, I just want to adjust the curve here. Okay, that's good. And you know what, I think I'm gonna bring these out just a bit more. And yeah, this whole thing's looking a little strange. Let's pull that up. And let's see, these points, I want to keep these snapped to the grid. So I'm just repositioning these, repositioning these points so that they're snapping on that grid, just so that it's easier to model, because the next part of this, let me go ahead and extrude it. So I just alt clicked and added an extrude object. That's certainly too much of an extrusion. So let's say 5 centimeters, and I'm going to turn off snapping and move this thing down a bit, like so. Let's see. So that's still quite a bit. Yes, Simon?
Another quick question from Rob. Can you draw half a shape and then mirror it
Yeah,
rather than snapping and doing it on both
absolutely.
sides?
I'm actually about to do exactly that. Let me just, that's the, so we have a really important issue when we're doing spline modeling, and that is the intermediate points. So you can see that the spline, so bear with me and you will get that answer. You can see that the spline itself is more curved than the actual geometry being generated. So what we can do is change the intermediate points to something like, I like natural, but then I'm missing some down here. I'm actually just going to increase the number of natural points here to add that detail that I want. So now it's much better representation in polygons to that spline. So now the next bit, I'm actually going, it's going to be the bracket. Let's see here. Where are you? Here we go. So this is actually two parts. The part that I'm going to be doing first is this one, okay? And then there's going to be an arm that connects everything. But this, I needed to match with the fan blade. So I'm actually going to use the fan blade spline as a starting point. I'm going to control click drag it to make a duplicate and go into my top view. And let's hide the other stuff. And I'm already in points mode, so I can go ahead and right click and select my line cut. And I'm just going to create a cut across here. Oh, snapping is not on. So I'm actually going to escape, undo, and then Shift S enable snapping, and then do that cut again. There we go. Now we're snapping to the grid point. And then with that line, I can hit escape, and there I have those 2 points. Now, I don't need these 3 any longer, so I'll delete those. And this curve I really don't need. So with my spline pen active, I can double click on that to make it a hard edge. And speaking of this functionality, I did forget to do that here. So I actually want to go to, let's turn this off, go to this point and double click on it, and go to this point and double click on it. And then on this point, same thing, but here I'm actually going to hold Shift and adjust that tangent handle. Once I adjust one, I can adjust the other without holding Shift. And then I can move this up
I
to
think
a
you're
closer.
showing the answer to the next question, and I think you might have covered it briefly, but a question from Damien about your preference for splines. I think you mentioned it because you prefer and you're more used to using them, but is there a technical reason for an advantage of splines for something like this?
For me, it's just it's a personal preference. This was fast. It's for me, it's faster, and I feel like I have a cleaner control over the curve here. If I was doing this with polygons, I would, you know, we'd end up with, let's go like here and then make it editable, and then I'd say select some of these edges and then scale them in, and maybe deselect another one and then scale that in. Oops, wrong button. And then scale that in, and I just sort of keep doing that. Or I could use like another option would be to use soft selection. So I select this edge, go to my scale tool, enable soft selection, and then I could scale this down. That's linear, So here it's like, you see, I have all these other settings now that I have to start figuring out which setting do I want. And, it's just, for me, it's, extra clicking, a waste of time. So I guess with another way. I mean, there's 100 different ways to do this. It all comes down to personal preference and the
Got it.
goals for the project. You know, the animation that I have planned for this, you know, it's not like a character, so I don't need some huge amount of like super clean loops in certain places. So yeah, I don't know. That was a bit of a rambling answer, but did I answer it?
That was good. Yes, yes, you did. I think that's a good
Oh.
point about the number of ways and what works in different situations, depending on what you like to use as well.
So let's see, I'm going to finish up modeling this bit. So I'm actually going to go back to the spline pen and control click. Let's zoom in so I can see some more points here. And I'll say, let's go here, control click, and then here, 1, 2, 3, and control click, right in the middle, control click. So I've added these 3 points, and this one I'm going to drag down to say here, double click to round it. And let's see, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here making these all look great. I just sort of want to, like I mentioned earlier, do a rough breakdown. So, you know, with the fan blade, which let's rename this fan blade, with it, we have a, you know, very solid object. But with this bracket, I actually need it to have some holes in it. So if we go back, you can see there's these holes essentially. And this can be accomplished simply by adding to the spline. So I'm actually going to zoom in, and with this spline selected and the spline pen tool, I'll just here click, and then on this side click, and then here click. I'm snapping 2 grid points each time, and then going the same number over here so it's symmetrical, and then I just can double click on these points to round them out. Now for the, here is the answer to that previous question about, can I just model half? Well, yeah, so I'm just gonna sketch using the sketch spline pen. I'm just gonna sketch this part. Oops, snapping is on. Let's hit Shift S and sketch this bit like so. I do wanna make sure that this is closed, which it is, and I can see that it's a separate object. That's my own fault because of a setting I did not check. It's fine. I'll just select both of these objects, connect, and delete them. Now on this one section, that looks horrible. So I'm gonna go to the spline smooth pen, and I'm just gonna quickly go over that area. Now I wanna mirror this to the other side. So I'll select all those points. I will right click, and then here is the mirror command. I'll just click apply, and there we go. So I could have done the whole, you know, just half of it, and then mirrored it, but I, you know, that, I don't know, it's just not how I practiced it.
Yes, it's several ways to do the same thing. And an extension of that question from Roman, for people who are starting out with Cinema, are there some key concepts, perhaps like this with splines, but are they key concepts you'd recommend starting off with or learning first?
In working and modeling with splines?
Or just in general in Cinema for modeling?
Well, you know, definitely the most important thing before you can do anything in Cinema 4D is being able to comfortably navigate the 3D view. Because if you cannot tell that, like now I can see these are not lined up, you know, you cannot tell that just by being in the top view. And if you are not moving around in your view regularly, you will miss that type of thing, and it will make everything difficult. Now, speaking directly to modeling with splines, one of the most important things is being able to control how the geometry is generated. So I actually showed that a moment ago on the fan blade. And that's important not only to get good curves, but also for things to deform cleanly. And we'll see that when we get to the fan blade. But let me show you how you can fix this type of issue here, where they get sort of offset like that. I'm just going to go to my, with all those points selected, go to the scale tool. And then I'm just going to, actually, I don't even have to go to the scale tool. You can just go to the coordinates manager down here and set the size Y to 0 and hit enter. And then now it's all flat, which is exactly what I want, so that when I extrude this, let's see, let me center the axis, so that when I extrude it, I'll click on the extrude, we'll make it a child of that. Then you see now I have that, that shape with holes in it. This is certainly too great of an extrusion, and I want it to be on this side. So it's, it's a little off from my original shape because of the order that I was doing things, but it's not a huge problem. I might be able to get away with just scaling those out a bit. So, I mean, in the real world, objects aren't always perfectly lined up, right? So we don't mind a little bit of, natural offset to something. Anyway, getting back to that issue of some fundamentals of modeling with splines, here I can see that those curves aren't really matching up. So I'm going to go to the spline and set its intermediate points to natural, and then I'll just increase the number of natural intermediate points. Intermediate points are those points which the spline creates in between the actual points that allow for the curve. If we set this, for example, to none, then you see it's all based on just point-to-point, interpolation. It's all very linear, right? So that's a very key thing. Let's see. Also, when you're working with the spline pen, you definitely want to, and anything else in Cinema 4D that you're learning, you want to get used to either right-clicking on a command and doing show help, or mousing over a command and then doing controller command F1, which will open up the help and go directly to whatever your cursor was over. Okay, let's get back here and see how these are lining up. It is on the bottom, good. Now for the next part, how are we doing on time? 1:30, okay. For the next part, it's, again, working with splines and generating geometry from them. And that is the arm that connects the, where is it? Here we go. It's the arm that connects that bracket to the motor. Let's turn on the clone there. Yeah. So this is actually a loft NURBS, and what it does is it basically stretches a skin, essentially, from one spline to the next. So the order of the splines in this list and how they look are absolutely the most important thing here. Whereas with these shapes, it's just sort of a general shape that I'm adding thickness to. Now I'm doing something very different. And for the starting point here, I'm going to go to, let's call this bracket. I'm going to take this spline, I'm just going to copy it, and I'm going to select only this circle. And then I'm going to invert the selection and delete all that. So I have just this bit here, which I can now line up to be the starting point for this shape, which I'm going to be like duplicating and manipulating. So let's see. We'll get there. All right. So I got this one spline. What I need to do with it is, well, center the axis to it so that it's right there, which makes it easy to hold the control key and click and drag to duplicate it. And every time I do that, I'm going to move it down and rotate it a bit. And, you know, I'm not sure if I actually showed you with the loft NURBS. If I turn off the loft NURBS, then we get, boom, these are the splines that are actually being used by the loft. So, you know, like everything else I'm doing, which I'm doing very rough and quick, the more time that we put into it, the more, you know, the more desirable, the more interesting and accurate it will be. But let's just go back here. I just want to show you how I sort of rough in all of this, and then I can sort of go back and tweak it. Now, I do need the motor here so I can see where it has to connect. Okay, so let's control click drag again and go to the rotate tool and rotate that a bit. And let's go over here and rotate it. Now on these last few, I'm not going to rotate it just so you'll see the issue, why it's important to rotate them. So I'll just go control click drag and then control click drag and control click drag. And then all of those splines I'm going to put into the on menu, into the loft. And we can tell by the icon that this is the one that has like the skin that goes over the splines. The white line is the spline and the green part is what is generated from it. So drop that in, and the fastest way really is to just select all the splines and drop them in. And you can see at the end where I was not rotating those splines, how we're losing that thickness, that volume to it. So it's, you know, it is important as you reposition these that you rotate them to maintain the thickness or the volume. And let's turn that back on. And so like this one, you know, I would want to, you know, move it or rotate it. But these are all the same shape, which is why this is so much like just sort of some tube. But, you know, what ideally, and we don't have the time for it here, but, you know, we want to put more time into these and we want to get, you know, varying shapes to create more interest, right, with the design.
For these sorts of things, Darrin, where you're modeling something which is very physical and it's got solid structure to it, the splines are working really well. Would you approach this for this modeling for more organic character modeling as well? This is another question from Roman.
No. And that is a really common thing, especially with people that start out working in Cinema 4D Lite. You know, they get really excited about working in 3D and they want to start building characters using the modeling tools in Cinema 4D Lite, which are, you know, pretty limited to just the spline-based stuff that I'm showing you. But the thing is, we cannot create the type of seamless geometry using splines to model a character. This is great for you know, man-made stuff, for props, but you know, when you're doing something as complex as any type of character, then you know, ideally you'll need to do that using polygonal modeling tools, and we'll hopefully have another webinar on that sometime in the future. So stay tuned. Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, so you know, that's just sort of a rough breakdown of the loft. There's some, you know, great options here for controlling the subdivision. So we can get very different shapes here. So this here actually has less to do with the intermediate points than some of those others, because this has an actual mesh subdivision value. But I'm counting this bit done. So I'm actually going to call that arm, and I'm going to take these three, and let's see, I'm going to actually add a null object to the scene, and I'll call this fan blade assembly. How am I doing on time, Simon?
You've got a little over 20 minutes.
So I've grouped them all together, and then I can just drop them into a cloner set to radial mode with a radius of 0, and I just want 4 of them. Now this, let's see, the light bulb is a sphere, so at least that's how it starts out. Bring it down. There's also a bit in the middle that is like just another cylinder. What I'm not getting into are the screws that I've added here. They're actually from the preset, the content library presets. So if you go to your content browser and you do a search for screw, then you'll get some textures. Those are actually sculpt brush presets. Here's an eye screw, but there's these guys, and you can just sort of drag and drop them into your scene. And then you'll get this guy here, which you can then scale and position how you want. And that's basically all I did to add the screws and nuts and bolts. Let's see here. So I'm going to roughen this bulb. I'm going to add some segments here. And it's a little big. There's also, if we look back at the render, oh, I pointed out that cylinder. So I'm just going to add a cylinder and then scale it down like so. Move it up a bit. Now I'm going to control click drag and make it that one a little more narrow. Let's actually bring this one down a bit. And then on this more narrow one, it's a bit tall. So let's bring it down and add some rounding on it and on the other one. So what I want to happen now is I want one of these to sort of be in its dream state. So if we take a look at the render here, this one fan blade is sort of bendy. It's sort of lazy or dreaming. It doesn't want to be a rigid wood blade, right? So I actually did that using a spline wrap deformer. So I'm gonna get a spline in, or you know what, I'll just draw one. So I'll come in here and I'm gonna go to my spline pen and I'm gonna get in and be as accurate as possible from here. It's off a little bit, that's okay, we'll live. To here, and then let's see, maybe it comes down a bit there, and then I'm just sort of approximating the length of it like so, like that. So that's nice and awkward. And what I want is I want the fan blade to bend with that, and I'm going to use the spline wrap, but I only want one of them, so I will take this out by duplicating it. Actually, you know what? Let's do the whole assembly. So I'll take this. Yeah. Let's do the whole assembly. So I'll just duplicate it out, and let's hide this guy. So I really just want to focus on this fan blade. So I'm gonna, with it selected, hold Shift and add the spline wrap deformer. And let's go into our perspective view. So it automatically, because of how I added it, sort of sized it. But let's set this up, see how it looks. So I'm going to tell the spline wrap deformer to use that spline that I just drew, and I can see that something weird is happening. I always need to change the axis. So I usually just go click on it and then go down, 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 till I find the one I want. I know that this is what I want despite this rotation, which we can we can fix simply by unfolding these rotation settings and tweaking the banking. So I'll say negative 90 there. And we can start to see some of the problems in working with curved surfaces from splines and generators. It's this these n-gons, and the awkward shading it creates, especially when we're trying to deform things. So the way that we can help sort of soften, remove this to a degree is by actually having an appropriate geometry. There aren't enough segments in the caps. So in the extrude, I go to caps and I'll set the caps type to Delaunay. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And if we unfold this setting, then, then we have this density. And I can just sort of drag that up, get more polygons which deform more cleanly. And we have less of that, those shading artifacts here. You know, I do actually want a bit of rounding on here. So I'm going to go to load preset. I'll add the basic rounding with a really small radius. So we get just enough of a curved edge. And I can see that that sort of has offset this fan blade. To fix that, I actually need to move the spline up because the object is being wrapped onto the spline. The spline is what needs to be repositioned, not the fan blade itself. So with that one tweaked, I can, let's see, this will be like dreaming blade. Now I have this problem of that overlapping fan blade. Oh, look, I made another problem. And I can, let's select this, bear with me, right click and right click centers that out. I can address this cloning issue by going to that cloner and in its properties. And you know what? I think this is another good point to not using the array. Without comparing the two, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. But here, I'm just gonna actually set the count to 3. And now the problem is I need it to actually start 90 degrees off. And now finally, I have all 4 of those positioned right how I want them. So let's see, 15 minutes. All right, so the next bit that I want to show is the chain. Let me hide let's drag this down here. Let's hide the spline wrap from the view because it's a little distracting. You know, one thing I want to show real quick with the spline wrap is in its rotation settings, we have all these graphs, and these are really great for adding some extra interest in here. So I can create that cool little sort of warping that I like. All right, moving off.
Darrin,
Yeah, go ahead.
we had a question about cloning. This may be relevant when you're making the chain, and this is from Rob. Is there a way to treat each instance in a cloner as its own object?
Yeah, I mean, we do that with you know, effectors or a formula in an effector. Every clone in a cloner is actually its own object. The whole benefit of the effectors to animate clones is that we can animate so many objects quickly and easily. But they are actually, even though they're clones, they are all separate clones. So they are like separate objects. And there's, depending on what you want to do, there are many ways to animate or texture or deform or whatever you want with them. Here, because I just had like this one hero element, I really only needed this one to be split off. If I were doing something on all of these, then I would approach it, through, the cloner or some formula. I don't know. I actually haven't thought about that. But the point here is that I really only needed this one to be unique. So it just made more sense to work with it as its own unique object. Now, speaking to that question, I have this chain with all these little ball bearings, right? And they sort of go from being a little chrome ball chain into these like bubbles. So here, and I'm going to set this up now. This actually also uses some spline dynamics. So let me set that up and let's see if that answers a question. I'm going to drop in a tube and set its axis and tweak its size and position and its length. I'm just clicking and dragging on these little orange dots, and then I'll go to the scale tool, bring that out and down. And I think that will do for now. I just need to draw a spline here coming out of this guy. So let's go to the spline pen, and snapping is off, which is good. And I'm going to go, oops, too many clicks. I'm going to go click here, and then I'm actually going to, so I'm adding 1 point for the start of this rope or chain, and then I'm going to add another point for the end. And then let's see, I want that to, and then I'm just going to hit escape. So this is a very simple 2-point spline, which now I am actually going to subdivide. And I do it this way because that way I can get, I'm clicking on the gear icon. So I can say, let's subdivide it, I don't know, 6 times. And I get this sort of, that's not evenly distributed. And I actually want these to be evenly distributed. So I'm going to undo that and set this to a natural or uniform should be better. But let's try that again and see if changing the intermediate points affected that. Click, subdivide. No, interestingly. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to subdivide it by the lowest value. Whoa. Hopefully you guys didn't see that. Yeah, I accidentally set it to 100 instead of 2. There we go. So now we have a point in the middle and on the end. And then I'll just go US is the keyboard shortcut, US, US. And that's good. I'm happy with those number of points. Now to get the dynamics on this, I'm going to just apply the hair tag spline dynamics. And if I press play, it'll all drop, which I don't want. I need this very first point to be fixed. So in the spline dynamics tag in properties, I'll just select that 1 point and then click set fixed or fixed set button. And so now when I press play, we see it, that point stays, but the rest of it drops. It's not colliding with the sphere because I have not added to it the hair tag hair collider. So now it'll collide, but I actually need it to be a slightly larger radius. So it has room for the ball. So in the spline dynamics tag, there's this radius setting in properties. I'm going to set that to, let's say 1.5. And I'm going to let this play out. And I'm going to stop it there so that I can go to the tag settings and click set initial. So now when I rewind, I can press play again and let it sort of settle a bit more, set initial, rewind, settle a bit more, stop, set initial. I'm happy with that. And now I'm going to do the ball chain with just a sphere, which, remember that radius I set earlier? That radius, let me show you according to the help, right click, show help. It actually illustrates, oh, they removed the image that illustrated this parameter. What a bummer. But it actually creates, you can see now there's sort of a gap between the spline and the sphere. That's that radius. So I need the little ball chains, which I'm going to put into a cloner. And then, so this should be the same radius. I think I did 1.5. Now on the cloner, that needs to be the object mode. And the object I'm cloning onto is that spline, which I'll rename chain. And now to get them all lined up next to each other, I just need to set the distribution from simply being a count to being per step. And that step is going to be, the sphere's radius is 1.5, so the actual width of the sphere is 3. Now they're all right up next to one another, and at the end of it, I need that little grab, that little handle. So I like the tube for this, or excuse me, the cone, because it has these really great controls in the caps top and bottom to really fine tune the rounding on both ends. We can't really accomplish this shape with any other parametric object. So I'm going to make that smaller and just sort of move it down, get a feel for how big it is, and then put it in the cloner as well. Now the problem is it's actually going, we got about 6 minutes. So what I need to do to see just that cone is use a effector and change how the cloner chooses which of these it uses. And that's all about sorting the clones. Now, let me go to the scene here where I have this already set up, so I can just sort of show you. Here we go. So here, what I've done is I have the cloner set to the sort mode. The first object is a sphere, and the second object is a cone. So the effector, which is a plane effector, is saying most importantly to modify the clone. What that means is modify which clone is being cloned, which object, which child is being cloned. And so that it is only happening on the end, I've added a spherical field right in here at the end. Okay, and that works with the dynamics too, which is wonderful. Now, earlier today, because we have 5 minutes left, earlier today I did go through how I did the, how I created the geometry for the melting glass dome. So let's see, you guys can review that video. I want to finish this out with the ceiling tiles, because one thing that I failed to show earlier was my reference. So this is actually, my goal here had everything to do with the ceiling tiles, not so much the fan. I just love these ceiling tiles and the look, and that old world charm that they give. So I want to get those ceiling tiles in. It's a really simple plane. So if I go back to my untitled project here, I'm going to use one large plane. It's just sort of going to be like behind the tiles is going to be this guy. But then in front of them, we're going to have our separate tiles. That's a bit big. I'll just sort of eyeball that with the scale tool, drop it into a cloner. The size of this is 152.4, so I'll make the cloner's size per step just beyond that. So let's say 154. So it's just enough to get a gap between those tiles. And then I can simply increase the count to my liking. And then I have roughed in the geometry, which tomorrow I will show how I created the displacement map from a preset texture in Cinema 4D's content browser. A little preview is this is that texture. This is actually in the content browser. I'll show you all of this tomorrow, how I made a displacement map from it. And let's go here. And I'm going to be showing how I used Quixel Bridge to do the fan blades, the wood texture, and how I used some other content browser from Cinema 4D presets to do the scratches on the motor and add some grime and weathering to all of these surfaces, as well as getting this blending between these two materials. That we're going to get to that. All this material blending, like on the bulb and on the chain, we're going to get to on Thursday. Tomorrow is going to be the big picture texturing all the objects. Oh my gosh. 2 minutes left. I definitely thank you everyone for coming. Simon, thank you for having me do this. This is my second webinar that I've ever done. I'm so used to doing one-on-one training or video tutorials. So this has been, really, really fun. Another thing for tomorrow is these spider webs. What do we have time for any questions?
Well, I was just going to say, there's more observations that are coming in as well as questions, Darrin. A lot of people saying how useful and informative this was. And it's interesting that you originally said this is going to be some basic techniques, but you've packed it in there with not only techniques about doing certain things a certain way, but I think what is super valuable is your approach and how you might solve these problems. As simple as you would interpret it about why you would use a deformer on the blade rather than another technique, I think is very valuable. Because a lot of these projects have these multiple disciplines in them, because we don't necessarily have to make one static object. As you've got a static object, but you're taking it into more of an organic view or an organic kind of story. So it's very interesting to see how you approach that.
Yeah, and they're and as you, the attendee, become more familiar with Cinema 4D, then you will begin to discover for yourself what's faster and what makes more sense for you when you're doing these types of things. Let's see. One thing that I showed earlier was sort of this this process that I went through. Let's see. Show in Explorer. So I actually have. Let's go down here. Number of images that sort of, show that. Oh, I started at the wrong end. There we go. Oh, it loops. Okay, so I started out with this, and I'll just go through these real quickly. So I used this project, and I failed to mention this, as a vehicle to learn Redshift. So that's part of why this geometry is so sort of rough. It's not about the super detailed, accurate modeling. This was a vehicle for me to learn Redshift, and it was, it's been perfect at that. Yeah.
It's interesting because we had a couple of other questions about tomorrow, and a couple of technical ones. How do you register for tomorrow? So you'll get the recording for this session automatically by email, and I'll make sure I've included in there the PDF where you can register for tomorrow and for Thursdays. In fact, you can download it now because it's in the chat section, that link inside the chat section called Connecting the Dots. That's a PDF where you can register for tomorrow's sessions or watch the earlier session for today. As Darrin mentioned, if you want to see modeling the actual globe and how that melting light bulb was created, and you can just catch that. So you don't have to sit through the whole thing. You can actually fast forward and find out that piece. It's around about 45 minutes in, I think you do that.
It's the same order in that video. So just jump towards the end until you see me doing a whole bunch of stuff with the sphere. You'll see some sculpting, and then you'll see some volume-based modeling to get the drippy, melty bit on the sphere.
See, this is the interesting thing. This is much more than an hour's content that you've just gone through, Darrin, but it's it's like speed training. But and I think, as you mentioned earlier on, it's the idea to show you the approach and how you might think about a project before actually executing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. It's so obvious, all your years of experience coming into this, because you're able to think through immediately. So some of us don't have that luxury, of course. So it's been very useful.
Well, I've had the luxury to gain that over many years of experience. So lucky me.
Quick last question. Somebody's asked about Redshift. Are there any plans for Mac support? It's public knowledge that we're working on the Mac version, and the answer is the same as we gave out previously, which is soon. But this time we mean it. So bear with us. So we know that you're waiting diligently for it and patiently for it. So thank you. But yes, we hope soon to have more information about that. But a lot of comments, by the way, Darrin, about how useful this has been and how the techniques. So I just wanted to personally thank you again for doing this and doing all the hard work preparing it. So we're looking very much forward to tomorrow's session as well.
Yeah, tomorrow's all
and Thursday. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for being here.
Forward to it.
Thank you, Simon.
So thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. We just about kept it to an hour, 4 minutes over. That's probably a record, more or less. So thanks for bearing with us. Okay, well, stay healthy, everyone, and we'll see you on the next one. All right, take care. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.